when you look at who's in prison in its entirety, it's sure we have some numbers of people who led struggles, who led movements, who took conscious actions, but it's also people who are not necessarily just victimized by the empire, by the state, but who are also resistant in far less clearly conscious ways, who end up functioning in their own lives, in their own community, both cut off from the potential of their own humanity by the social structure that they're in, the repressive nature of, what living in a black or brown community looks like and feels like, but then also demanding a level of their own survival. And that leads to a level of resistance that's far less easily recognized unless you're living in that environment. But the state understands that, and the state is very targeted in how it tries to snuff out human potential. So that, to reference what's happened far more recently in California, maybe, in terms of a prison struggle that coalesces around some demands that are fundamentally about human rights, particularly focused on unlimited levels, unlimited years of life in isolation. Who's in isolation and why are they in isolation? People are put in isolation because of how they identify themselves as part of something that is resistant to state violence. The institution of imprisonment calls that gangs, but really it's a form of social identity that is about reinforcing a level of identity around the repressive nature of life outside the prison, and is extended to an identity that is about self-protection and survival in the prison. It's not at all illogical. It's not hinged on unrestrained, crazy violence like the violence of the state. It's a survival mechanism that I think is totally legitimated by the colonial nature of the institution. And what we see in 2011 is a recoalescing of that inside the prisons. And even recently for me, in prison visits that just happened within the last few weeks, the clarity of what in California is called an agreement to end hostilities, to resolve internal contradictions, and to bring about a level of unity that is no longer internalized, but starts to define the nature of prisoner on one hand and the institution of the prison on the other, and to see that as a form of conflict that is built into the reality of what imprisonment is, so that the enemy is no longer the set across the way, but the enemy is the structure of the state and the prison itself. Much like on a very visceral level, people understand the relationship to the police in the community. The police are the enemy. And that's something that the state fears more than anything else, that kind of political process of starting to identify, who the real enemy is in the situation. And so that's the punitive nature of prisons is escalated, so that the use of isolation over years and decades is intentional with anybody who shows any potential to provide a level of leadership and resistance on the inside.